welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, A Healthy Carmen, 16th of October 2014. Healthway's website states, Healthway seeks to promote and support healthy lifestyles to reduce the burden of preventable disease in Western Australia. How does sponsoring Georges Bizet's opera, Carmen, fit in with that statement, with or without smoking? Christian Dooley, Atterdale. Okay, so a few factual inaccuracies here. First of all, Healthway did not sponsor that opera. Healthway sponsored WA Opera, the opera company which puts on a large variety of operas, one of which was slated to be Carmen. So, they undertook to sponsor WA Opera, and the question here would be, where does that fit within Healthway's stated goals? And the simple answer would be that Healthway, through whatever process, determined that the opera audience was one to which health promotion would be useful. Now, I suspect that, given the demographics of the average opera attendee, that is, that they tend to be fairly well off, upper middle class, and sort of middle-aged at least, we would probably not be looking at smoking. So smoking prevention efforts are generally targeted at young people and poor people to a certain extent, because those are the key demographics in smoking here in Western Australia. And I'm pretty sure that a member of the Healthway board has even come out and said as much, that the focus of this sponsorship of WA Opera wasn't about smoking efforts. So what happened, I suspect that it, and just on speculation, that it was actually alcohol, probably, or maybe even obesity would be the two main concerns, possibly other things, I'm not sure, that they would be hoping to reach out to the opera attendee. The thing was, once they had gone through with their sponsorship, somebody realised, and I think it was somebody within WA Opera, that they were going to they wanted to stage Carmen, and Carmen has a scene which is set, I think, at a cigarette factory. And that I think it often features smoking. And Healthway has, as I've previously mentioned, a very strong requirement in their contract that says that you cannot do anything which would be contrary to their kind of image, if you like, if you have Healthway sponsorship. So then that issue came up. So my understanding is Healthway was not sponsoring Carmen, to start with. It was sponsoring WA Opera, but almost certainly not for smoking, for other things. But they cannot be found to be sponsoring. They essentially don't want their brand next door to unhealthy promotion of lifestyles, anything involving things like smoking. And that's what this all came about. So almost all of this I got from reading the paper. So Christian Dooley, if you'd read the paper as well, you'd be about as well informed as I am, and you would understand that none of this is much of an issue. Next up. Object to a rego hike, 17th of October 2014. The proposal for a no-fault motor vehicle insurance costing an extra $109 to register a vehicle is another tax grab by the Barnett government. No-fault insurance proposal news, 16th of the 10th. I suspect there must be at least 1 million registrations a year, which would generate more than 109 million for Treasury coffers each year. If readers don't want a big fee increase, they should visit the Insurance Commission of WA website and say so. Wayne Tagg, Wanneroo. Okay, so the backstory to this is that WA, unlike some other states, I believe New South Wales and a couple others, doesn't have compulsory third-party insurance for the passengers in a vehicle for their injuries in the event of a crash. What this means is that if I'm driving and I have a crash and a passenger in my vehicle is injured, they are not insured for the costs of their health, etc. Which means that is a burden on the WA public because they have access to public health like everybody else does. We do have, I think, certainly the drivers of, and I think even the passengers of, another person's car. If I crash into them and it's my fault, the Insurance Commission of WA does insure the passengers in that car. My understanding is they simply don't insure the passengers in my car. So there's been a talk to extend the compulsory third party that you pay as party registration to cover all passengers, not just passengers in somebody else's car, but passenger in your own car as well. That this would reduce the burden on WA taxpayers funding it through, and other taxpayers funding it through the Medicare system and our public health system. So really what this is shuffling the costs of the rehabilitation and medical treatment of accident victims away from the general taxpayer to drivers, or actually car owners, because you'd be paying it part of rego. So it sort of really is just a tax shift. Whether or not this is a good idea, I'm not sure. I'm not really well versed on the pros and cons. But what it isn't, I can tell you, is not a tax grab. Yes, it may look like that because it would be an increase on rego fees. That is, car owners would pay more to register their vehicles. The argument, therefore, would be, though, that this would then cover the costs of treating car accident victims. And therefore, that would be a reduction in burden of costs to the overall taxpayer who pays for the public health system. So there wouldn't be necessarily any kind of tax increase. Now, whether you would see that in a reduction in your taxes, probably not, because governments, once they've got taxes, they do like to hold on to it. But this is not just a tax increase. This is a shifting of the burden to where it most likely belongs. And with the ballooning costs of, say, public health and the fall in revenues for state governments, this is not an unreasonable proposal. As I say, I'm not actually up to date too much on the details of it. It seems on the face of it to be a fairly reasonable idea, especially given that there are other states in Australia that are already doing it. Way too lenient. 17th of October 2014. Department of Fire and Emergency Services are to issue a $750 fine for activating a false fire alarm. $750 fines for false fire calls, news 14th of the 10th. But will only issue the fine after 3 false alarms. It should be only 1. There is no second warning if anyone impersonates a police officer. Frank Cherry, Southlake. Okay, so the problem I have with this is the false equivalence. A false fire alarm here, that is calling 000 and reporting a fire falsely, or otherwise setting off some kind of emergency response, is not the same as impersonating a police officer. And impersonating a police officer undermines, fundamentally, public trust in the police. So a huge amount of the edifice of policing and our trust in the police is built, one of the foundations of that is the idea that somebody wearing a police officer's uniform or presenting themselves as a police officer is actually a police officer. If we couldn't trust in that, if we became like, I guess some third world states might be, or totalitarian states where you are simply not allowed to question whether somebody is a police officer, and anybody presenting, therefore, as a police officer, you have no way to know whether this is just a person with a gun or whether this is somebody, who is actually a legitimate person in authority, is a very, very serious concern. And so, necessarily, anybody who impersonates a police officer here is subject to some fairly stringent penalties. The good news is it's often well-intentioned but misguided people who have some kind of psychological issue who end up getting caught up in this. And so the penalties are never that great because the person's nefarious intent is rarely there. Now, activating a false fire alarm is a significant issue if people are doing it with some kind of regularity. Calling out the full force of the fire brigade to deal with fires that don't actually exist. 1 is costly to the taxpayer, but 2 also diverts resources that could be used to fight fires elsewhere. I'm not aware that there's been a significant increase in that, but there's certainly been an increase in the fines recently, as there's been increasing fines across the board, as an attempt possibly to shore up falling revenues. That said, again, we generally find that false fire alarm usage generally comes from people who don't have nefarious intent. These are generally people who are otherwise law-abiding citizens who have, for want of a better term, some kind of screw loose. This is not the sort of demographic who are necessarily affected all that much by fines. This is the kind of demographic for whom a stern talking to often works to divert them to hopefully more pro-social pursuits. And therefore the idea of giving a couple of warnings before you give a fine is hardly a terrible thing. If we have serial false fire alarm people, they will still get caught. You only have to do it 3 times to get a fine, so if people are doing it multiple times, they're going to get caught up in this. For those people who do it once as a joke and then realise the seriousness of it when they get told off, this will avoid unnecessary financial impingement on them. And seems well within, to my sort of understanding, the principle of applying the least possible punishment to achieve the desirable outcome. So I don't see it as much of an issue. show me the facts if you've got any. Surplus of personnel, 17th of October 2014. So humanity might be bowled over by the Ebola virus. It's so good to see nature striking back every once in a while, trying to restore some sort of balance to gross overpopulation. Brad Capes Kublup. Oh god. So there's so much wrong with these kind of sentiments. Firstly, I suspect that the only reason this person, well, maybe not the only reason, but a lot of the people who have this kind of sentiment, it is founded at least in the idea that Ebola is happening somewhere else to other people. Many of the people who don't really have much of an issue with Ebola do so partly on the fact that it's happening to African people and it's not happening to Australians. And that's at least xenophobia, if not straight-out racism. The other thing I take issue with is a lot of sentiment is personifying nature as some kind of force and separating us from it. Human beings are animals. We are part of nature as much as anything else. Yes, we behave quite differently from a lot of other animals, but to see this as some sort of like humans unbalancing nature, and this is nature fighting back, is to see a kind of woo spirit in the world, as sort of a Gaia hypothesis that is it's just completely wrong. And seeing Ebola as some kind of force for good because it's wiping out overpopulation misses the fact that overpopulation is a human problem. And it's a human problem that requires human solutions. That nature is not going to solve it for us by, creating Ebola. If we want to do something about overpopulation, and we should, then we need to do something about it. We can't rely on nature to somehow fix the balance. Because whenever these kind of things happen, it's just an excuse for ignoring the fact that they're wiping out the poor and the destitute and the disadvantaged overwhelmingly. Even within the West African countries, which are not... Africa is not a monolith, and these West African countries are not a monolith either. That overwhelmingly it's the poor and the rural and the uneducated and the isolated people within these areas that are dying. So it always falls on the most vulnerable within societies. And to sort of personify this as some kind of natural occurrence removes any burden on us to do something about it. I suspect that these same people would be much more worried if it was striking the more affluent people in Western societies. Lastly, which church? 18th of October 2014. From where does the Church of M.J. Gonzalez, Sin and Marriage, Letters 7th to 10th, draw its authority that cohabitation without marriage is a sin, when the commandment only mentions adultery? Peter Collett, Geraldton. As an atheist, I take issue with people who misrepresent or don't understand what the Bible actually says. Now, I'm not an expert in the Bible, but most Christians understand the commandment against adultery to mean something more akin to sex outside the confines of marriage relationship, not the narrow definition of adultery that we commonly use in modern parlance, which is a married person having sex with somebody that they're not married to. So, a fairly common and historically grounded reading of the idea of adultery is that God has commanded us to only have sex with those people who we happen to be married to. Now, I say people because within the Old Testament, there are all sorts of marriages that don't necessarily fit the one man, one woman mold. There's plenty of one man and many women or slaves or concubines or whatever. But it's quite clear, it would seem to me, that most readings of the Bible would have God commanding people to only have the God-prescribed kinds of sex with the God-prescribed people. And that this does fit quite comfortably within M.J. Gonzalez's idea that cohabitation without marriage fits within the sort of biblical concept of adultery. Now, that's not necessarily what the word adultery means nowadays, but that's fairly straightforward. The other thing is that let's not get hung up on the commandments. I know lots of Christians do get hung up on the Ten Commandments, but they are just as wrong as the atheists who do so as well. The Bible contains many commandments, not just the 10. And in fact, the passage of the 10 commandments, well, I'm pretty sure there's 2 passages of 10 commandments, also contain other commandments. And it's not entirely clear how to differentiate between the first 10 and the rest. There are also many other places within the Old Testament and the New Testament where God or Jesus gives rules to believers about how they should live their lives. And it's not always clear what the hierarchy of these rules are and whether these should be elevated to the same level of the Ten Commandments or not. Let's not pretend that the Bible is very clear that there are 10 commandments and nothing else. That's not like it. So it would be quite legitimate for Christians to argue against, say, cohabitation without, having cohabitation before marriage on the basis that it is against something in the Bible without it necessarily being one of the 10 commandments. Now, why am I bothering with all this? Well, because there are very, very good arguments against Christianity or taking any of the commandments of Christianity seriously. So let's not get bogged down in interpretations of one of the 10 commandments as if that is some kind of legitimate authority. It is not. I don't care where MJ Gonzalez gets the idea that their God condemns sin. I don't care. I reject it utterly because I reject his God, his church, in any sense that they have any authority over us. So, I take objection to people like Peter Collett writing in and asking about, which commandment did you get this from? Because it's missing the point that it doesn't matter where in the Bible it comes from. The Bible is bunk and should be treated as such by any thinking person. Anyway, that's it for me this week. I'm feeling much better. I hope you are too. Join me next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.